I'm David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation. And this is Coffee and Wisdom, when we take a humanist perspective on theological and philosophical questions. This week, I've been looking at the beginnings of Christian theology. On Tuesday, I just looked basically at what is theology in general. Why do we do such a thing? And yes, the definition of theology, theos, the word for God, and logos, the study of God, and then sort of a motivated reasoning to look at what the idea of God means within a particular religious system. The theologian, David Tracy, one of my theological professors at the University of Chicago. Very famous theologian. This is a book called A Theology of Conversation by David Tracy. He famously says Christianity is what you get when you mix Judaism with Greek philosophy. Now, that's an interesting way of looking at it. He is a liberal theologian, and we've talked about what liberal means in terms of theology and Coffee and Wisdom. So, Christianity is what you get when you mix Judaism with Greek philosophy. But just what exactly does that mean? Who then was the first Christian theologian? Well, if you do a little bit of a web search on that, you're going to find all kinds of answers. Yes, a long time ago, but when did Christian theology actually begin? And there's some debate about that, actually. But there's one interesting fact that we know very well, that the Christianity before Paul and the Christianity after Paul are two different kinds of Christianity. The Christianity before Paul is very much a Jewish a kind of denomination of part of Judaism that developed in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem area, in Palestine, and then the religion of Paul, which is much more cosmopolitan and much more Mediterranean in the way that it worked. Now, most of the people who look at this early on in the 18th, 19th centuries saw these two, Peter and Paul, who were contemporaries, as, very amenable. And actually, the book of Acts does present it sort of that way, although we do see, even within the text itself, some disagreements between these two founders of Christianity. We know that Peter is given the keys to the kingdom by Jesus in the New Testament in Christian scriptures, but how much was he really the father of Christianity, and how much did Paul get involved? So we have St. Peter holding the keys in a particular painting here, pointing up, yes, and then Paul with a book, because he's quite the writer, also looking up, and both of them with halos. So, how does this really work out? Because, hey, we have this idiom, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Famously, it's about taking money from one place, putting it in another, but actually, it's a zero sum game. Now, how did that work in early Christianity? Actually, now, by tradition, the first Christian church was in Jerusalem, and it is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is still very much there today. And part of that church is the idea that it is sitting on the site of Christ's tomb, the tomb of Jesus, but also on the Golgotha Mount on which the cross was, where Jesus died. Now, that's part of the tradition that goes all the way back to the founding of Christianity, very much a Jerusalem kind of thing. But is Christianity actually a product of the Jerusalem group after the death of Jesus, if indeed Jesus did exist as many Christians think he did? Also, if you look at early Christianity, one of the things you're going to find, are maps or discussions of the 12 apostles and where they went to disseminate the idea of Christianity. And you're going to see all the way to India with Bartholomew. You're going to see Spain with Paul and James. You're going to see Scythia on up north with Andrew, and on and on. But how much of this is actually true, and how much of it is part of the legend of the very quick spread of Christianity in its early centuries? If you really take a look at it, it's much more important where Paul went. And you can find maps online to look at the journeys of Paul. Paul did indeed cover much of the northern part of the Mediterranean basin, all the way from Palestine, all the way over to Rome. And there, by tradition, he made one trip to Spain. Whether that is actually true or not, we really don't know. But he did indeed get around, and he did found churches in the places he went. So, what is Paul in terms of early Christianity, and what is Peter in terms of early Christianity? Now, also, one of the things we have to look at is the fact that many of the books in the Christian scriptures that pretend to be by Paul are actually forgeries. You can read about this by in a book called Forged by Bart Ehrman, a very much a historian of Christianity. Also, there are books out there looking at which of the writings that claim to be Paul's are really Paul's. The Authentic Letters of Paul is a book that I have on my shelf, as a matter of fact. Now, it appears that Paul wrote Galatians somewhere around 48 of the Common Era, first in Thessalonians, but not second, somewhere in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s of the Common Era, Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon, which is about a slave remaining a slave very famously. And those appear to be the authentic ones. Scholars are still looking at that, at this. By reading the Greek and looking at where the words are coming from in the text, they can tell where what time period this was actually written in. And that does make a difference in terms of Christian texts. This is still greatly debated, but apparently the first Christian text was the Gospel of Mark, somewhere around the year 50 of the Common Era. Now, this again is debatable. Some people put it at least 20 years later, but it appears that there were some writings floating around the year 50. But if it's also true that there was a Jesus as described in the New Testament, he would have been dead at least 20 to 30 years at that point. So we have a long period of oral translation through time, a kind of a game of telephone. Now, what's going to come next? Well, many people argue that actually the first Christian writing was by Paul. Again, as I mentioned, late 40s into the early 50s, and Paul writing the first Christian text. So, really, what is going on here, we don't exactly know. And it's still very much a bone of contention among very serious scholars. But what you're going to notice is that even at very conservative writings will say that Mark is probably the first around 50. It may be a letter of James, maybe, or probably, most scholars think nowadays, Paul was the first writer with his first Thessalonians. Then the era of the writing in the Christian scriptures, what's known as the New Testament in Christianity, go through John, which was sometime in the 90s. Now, so you're seeing this almost 100-year period here from the death of Jesus, if it occurred as it is described, all the way to this 90 to 95 when John was writing. Quite a long time for these all of these texts to be very much in some kind of oral transmission, and then into some kind of written transmission. So Paul of Tarsus, or Saul early, and then he becomes Paul, as we know famously. He probably was born somewhere around 5 of the Common Era and died somewhere around 64 to 65 of the Common Era. Again, tradition says he was martyred in Rome, although we really don't know that either. But you're going to find a lot of books that talk about Paul's contribution to Christianity, and it's very controversial how much of Christianity is Paul. Here's a book, The First Christian, St. Paul's Impact on Christianity. This is an early book by the now famous Karen Armstrong, very much the biblical scholar. And again, you're going to see a lot of writers saying, you know what? Paul was the first Christian. There are also books out there, such as this one by David Christian Clausen, Meet Paul Again for the First Time, Jewish Apostle of Pagan Redemption. Again, thinking about how does Paul leave Tarsus and go out and acquire the ideas of Christianity and then begin to transmit those. How did that happen? And also, then, the very much a part of debate is how much of Paul's teaching was actually Greek philosophy in origin rather than Judaism. We do know that he was a Jew and very much imbued with the theology of the Judaism of his time. But the writings, which are in Greek, very much reflect also the Greek philosophies of the time. You can find books such as Paul and the Stoics to read about how he used Stoic philosophy. And some of the Stoic texts are very much embedded in what he wrote. In other words, he was quoting, even though that fact has now disappeared from translations. Also, early Christianity and Greek paideia. That would be Greek learning by Werner Jaeger. And there are lots of discussions about how much Paul knew about Greek philosophy. Well, also John. John is the maybe author of the Gospel of John, some books in the Christian scriptures, and then the book of Revelation, which famously ends the New Testament with a vision of some kind of cataclysmic end to the history of humanity. So, reading John, a literary and theological commentary on the fourth gospel, and the Johannine epistles by Charles H. Talbert. Yes, lots of dissertations are written on this subject, and lots and lots of controversy and discussions. And you're going to get debunkers on the other side who want to protect Christianity from the idea that Paul is somehow cribbing or using Greek philosophy, very specifically Stoicism, in his writing. Ronald H. Nass, The Gospel and the Greeks, did the New Testament borrow from pagan thought? And his answer is absolutely not. The Christian message is unique. And you're going to see a lot of more evangelical scholars definitely arguing that, to say, no, Christianity is its own thing. It's a revealed religion, and it doesn't have anything to do with those Greeks. It goes back into Hebrew scripture. Very much an object of discussion. Let's take one little scripture to kind of think this idea through. This is John 1:1. Now, in case you don't know that right off the top of your head, it's in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is the one of the translations of this. But John 1:1 in Greek looks like this, if you can see my screen. And in that particular verse, you're going to see a word used twice, and that word in Greek is logos. Logos, as we put it into English today. Logos. So, the first translation out of the Greek then is going to be the Latin Vulgate, which becomes the central text for the Roman Catholic Church. And this is the Latin translation of the Greek text. And in it, it says this: In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. In the beginning, principio, principle, was, erat, the verb was, verbum. Ah, wait a minute. Verbum is very much, we still have the English word verb, and it's translated usually as word into English. But verbum is not logos, is it? It's a different word being used in the Latin. So in the beginning, it was the word, and verbum erat apud Deum. The verbum was with Deus, and Deus was the word, is how Jerome translated the Greek into Latin in the Vulgate. This becomes very much a cornerstone of Christian theology. Well, the King James Version into English does it, as I said earlier, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But notice what we've got here. We have logos in the original Greek writing of John. Then we have very much a translation into Latin, a different, though related language, but logos is not used there. It is verbum. And then into English, with the King James Version of the Bible of 1611, and verbum becomes word. So notice that logos becomes word, and that the word then, there's another step. We have three translations. Suddenly, we have another step that the word is equated with Jesus. Now, how did that happen? Because we have this already, this kind of wonky translation system going on. And then instead of translating logos as it would have been used at the time of the writing, we say, no, that logos, that means Jesus. So this is a case of theology affecting the use of a word long after its meaning had become standard in philosophy. Logos is a very ancient Greek philosophical term. It is not considered the word in any of the Greek texts. Logos is very important, but it means reason or plan, and often it design reason, much as in the much later idea of deism, which is that yes, there is a God, but this God permeates the entire universe and is actually a factor of reason within the universe. Very much used by the Stoics in that particular almost deistic kind of way. Certainly not a word to mean Christ. So that's kind of how early Christianity was dealing with these ideas, reinterpreting, backward interpreting, as such that here is our theology already in existence, and we're going to use these words to mean exactly what we want them to mean, not what they meant in the original Greek philosophical texts. So, a little overview of how Christianity starts out very much embedded in a Greek theological system and philosophical system, and then is taken out to the point that many don't see anymore the connection between the two. But other scholars, especially liberal scholars, are going to argue that there is a direct connection. Thanks for listening this week. Next week, I'm going to be looking at the radical Reformation. Yes, we know a Reformation occurred in which Roman Catholicism began to be questioned in Europe, and other denominations of Christianity. The Protestant Reformation begins. There are two Reformations, really. One that leads to a fairly conservative kind of Christian theology, and then one that leads to a very, very radical Reformation that ultimately leads, yes, to liberal Christianity and to humanism. Thanks for listening this week. If you have any comments or questions, you can email me, minister@firstunitarian.org. And we have a live Zoom meeting on Fridays at 9 a.m. Central Time. You are invited. If you would like the Zoom link, just email me, minister@firstunitarian.org. Thanks so much for listening this week, and I'll see you on Friday or next week for the radical Reformation.